This, though, is different in the sense that unlike the Ukraine conflict, where, you can pass off blame on a Cold War foe and, gin up Russophobia and all that, this kind of great power confrontation. Ooh, Russia's a boogeyman invading. You are having a situation where there's almost like a rewind of history in an attempt to do what the United States and, of course, Israel and its allies did during the War on Terror, which is paint a people in a region as a nation, really, if we talk about Palestine, as a bunch of terrorists, so they can just be eliminated. Well, people are kind of tired of that. That doesn't work as well as before. This is why you only see the most Karen-like, the most intensely Zionist-aligned folks talking about terrorism, this, terrorism, that. It's because most people, while they'll say, oh, we condemn what Hamas did, a lot of people might say that because, nobody likes to hear people are getting murdered. But even so, this narrative of, oh, they're all terrorists, let's get rid of them, and, oh, you can't support them. No, people see that ordinary people, civilians, women, children are being massacred.
My question is, what are your thoughts on the humanitarian pause or ceasefire in Gaza? Do you feel it's a step in the right direction or a misdirection from Zionists to take the land?
Well, I think the humanitarian pauses that are being implemented now are the concession, the very small concession that the Israeli government was willing to give to the United States. And the United States has been, the Biden administration, very worried about how this all looks. They're not worried about Palestinian lives, certainly. If they were, they wouldn't have been pushing more support to Israel, talking about unconditional support, all of this stuff for the duration of this latest massacre. But the Biden administration is worried about how this looks. So the humanitarian pauses, first of all, I mean, the language is just infuriating. Like, I have a hard time saying it because we already were in a place where the narrative is ceasefire. And there have been ceasefires in the past. Every time Israel makes an incursion on Gaza, makes an, wages a, elevates its kinetic war on Gaza, mowing the lawn, as they call it. Every time they do that, there's a ceasefire eventually because, Hamas and Palestinian resistance forces fight back. There's a protracted battle. Israel doesn't really like urban warfare. So after it bombs a bunch, it usually says, okay, well, we'll ceasefire. It doesn't mean the violence stops. It doesn't even mean it's ever respected. But it means that it's, willing to slow down the mow, to turn off the lawnmower, so to speak.
Got it.
So now we're at a point where we have millions of people on the street all across the West and in the world in general demanding a ceasefire. I mean, that's how backwards we become. Generally, that's just what happens when there is public pressure, international pressure usually too. But generally, that's just what happens after Israel mows the lawn, right? But now we're at a point where Israel's not mowing the lawn. Israel is setting fire to the entire strip, the entire concentration camp that it has entombed Palestinians within. So there is no ceasefire talk. You hear Netanyahu, you hear Blinken and Biden and all of them, Hillary Clinton even. I mean, they're all talking no ceasefire, no ceasefire. And what that means is they're willing to prolong this. So these humanitarian pauses, for me, feel completely about public relations. It's not about Palestinians. It's not about helping them. Because when you think about the situation, the chaos that has ensued in Gaza, it's really hard to believe that humanitarian aid, given that we've seen all the proof, the videos are out, when Palestinians were initially being displaced because they were, trying to escape this incessant bombing campaign, they were being bombed when they were walking toward the so-called south that they're being told to go to. So it's unclear whether that any aid will really get to them. But even if it does, it's not going to ameliorate the situation because it's not a ceasefire. It means that I think something like Palestinians will have like 4 hours for certain periods during the couple of times a day or something to not be bombed or shot at or, have their lives threatened. Maybe that will slow down the casualties to a degree. But certainly the way that Israel is waging this campaign, it's trying to avoid. There is urban warfare happening right now. Israel has basically invaded Gaza, has it penetrated the concentration camp, and is trying to fight Hamas at that level. Like it's trying to. But the majority of what it's doing is dropping bombs on refugee camps, on hospitals, on roads, on everything. It's just dropping bombs indiscriminately.
Yeah.
So that means many Palestinians are going to continue to die. And that is without any hope for a ceasefire if this language of humanitarian pause is normalized. Because when you think about it, pause doesn't mean stop at all. It means exactly what it means. It means when we're watching a YouTube video, we take a pause. At any moment, we turn it on again. If we're looking at a pause as progress, then we're basically ceding all control, all the power to determine what happens to Palestinians to the very people who are mass murdering them. And that is, I think, the biggest problem with the humanitarian pause is not least the issue of, well, it certainly isn't enough, and it certainly isn't going to preserve much life, and it certainly isn't going to stop this horrific massacre. And it certainly doesn't get at the larger problem here, which is that the United States has pivoted to this region. It's back in the Middle East, really because of Israel, what I feel like is opportunism here. I think Israel sees an opportunity to revamp what had been a dying, and I still believe it is dying, this kind of all-encompassing superiority, this Zionist influence, this idea that whenever Palestinians, Hamas, do anything, that they are the criminals in Zionism, Zionists, the Israeli government. They're the victims, right? That had been, how many massacres, mowing the lawns can you do before that starts to die up? And it had been. American Jews look at Israel a lot less favorably. Certainly, a lot of the world looks at Israel a lot less favorably. Israel had becoming more and more isolated over the years, so much so that it has felt the need. And I have been in disagreement with some people in the geopolitics sphere who used to talk about Israel, and some still do talk about Israel as maybe pivoting to the multipolar world. I never saw Israel as doing that. Israel was building better relations with Russia, of course, has a relationship with China, because everyone has to have a relationship with China, but especially with Russia, because Israel was just doing what's best for Israel. And of course, there's a long history between Russia and Israel, where you have Russian Jews settling in Israel. You have all kinds of connections, but also it's really a neighbor. Russia is literally right there. So it was never a pivot to multipolarity. I found that to be a complete oversimplification, given that Israel's very existence still to this day is to be a military outpost for the United States. And even though Israel, and this is true, although I'm sure you've heard this, JB, Israel controls the United States, Israel controls the U.S. government, Israel controls the media. That's an oversimplification. Israel has a lot of influence because it is so useful. If Israel acted like Syria, none of that would be the case. Israel is very useful to U.S. interests, so Israel is allowed to get away with a lot. Israel is also allowed to build a lot of influence inside of the United States because of the role that it serves. So the United States gives all the support Zionists have a huge influence in the political and economic, well, really the political and military sphere in the United States, economically too, of course, but I would say that's more indirect on people's consciousness. But it has a lot of influence politically, a lot of influence on the information sphere. And even so, the response to this shows that Israel is more isolated than ever. So this humanitarian pause stuff, I feel like, is not just bankrupt and not just completely and utterly infuriating and an insult, really, to what this moment calls for, but it also shows desperation on the part of the United States. The Biden administration understands that the more Palestinian bodies pile up in a mass grave that it is sponsoring, the less likely the United States is going to come out of this with the same international standing it had before this started. It is going to decline around the world. No matter how much bribery and how much bullyism it does in that region. I mean, the Saudi-U.S. relationship was already fraying. It's only going to continue to fray. Things like that are going to continue to happen. And also, it has potential harm on the domestic political situation in the United States. You have a lot of angry people about this. People are not happy. Yes, there are people in the United States. There are people in the West who have people are human beings. People understand suffering. People don't like to see suffering all the time. They feel something. They feel something when they see tens of thousands of Palestinians being bombed and killed, and 4 or 5,000 children being killed. They're seeing the images, and they don't like it. They see it as a crime, and more and more people are coming to this conclusion. So that means the domestic political situation is more unstable, especially for Biden, who, I mean, let's be honest, Biden was already going to have trouble defeating Donald Trump in the general election coming up in 2024. The longer this goes on, I mean, can you imagine the ammo that Donald Trump has? Of course, Trump is not going to be opposed to Zionism. I mean, look at what Donald Trump did during his administration. He was looking to strengthen. I mean, he did. He not only moved the capital to Jerusalem, but he also gave the Golan Heights to Syria. Essentially, he didn't give anything, but he signed off on all of that. I mean, those are major escalations. But at the same time, he has a huge amount of ammo to make Joe Biden look incredibly weak, because Israel literally looks like a mad dog that can't be reined in. And the Biden administration is showing no desire to even look the part, right? It's one thing to just unconditionally support this massacre that's going on. It's one thing to be completely aligned with the interests and motivations of the Israeli state, of the Zionist state. That's unsurprising in my view. What is surprising is when one of your it's supposed to be a client state. It's not supposed to be an equal partnership. Israel's economy, even its military, is everything about Israel is small compared to the United States. The United States is supposed to be the one, right? It's supposed to be the one wagging the tail, right? It's not supposed to be it's not supposed to be the other way around. Here, it doesn't look like that. Blinken literally went to Israel. I mean, he's been several times. The last time he went, he said, hey, maybe we could get kind of I think that this concession is actually a very weak concession in humanitarian pauses, because I think Blinken was asking for more. I think he was like, we need to reduce civilian casualties, and we need to consider, won't say ceasefire, but we need like a substantial pause, so that, not every Palestinian in Gaza is under rubble in the next couple of months. And what did Netanyahu said? He said, absolutely not. And that was the end of the story. He said absolutely not in his face. He said no. Any kind of real pause to this conflict is a gift to Hamas, and we're not going to do it until they release the hostage. That's essentially what he said. Release the hostages, the prisoners of war. Until they release the prisoners of war, we're going to bomb and kill them. We're gonna bomb them. If they're dead at the end, it's a better. I mean, Israel. Come on. Israel sees killing the prisoners of war as a better option than actually engaging in any kind of negotiations. to get them, because that means they would need to concede something to Hamas and to the Palestinian resistance in effect. So that's what Netanyahu said. He said that in Blinken's face. And I mean, this is after Blinken literally went around the region. He went to Jordan. After that, I think he was in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And he talked to Abbas, the neo-colonial entity at the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And all of them said, at the very least, man, you need to start talking about the two-state solution, and we need to start getting deep into that, because this is getting ridiculous. And all of them were angry that Blinken basically said, no, we're not doing that. So, no one's really happy with the United States. And I think the United States understands that its position in the region is a lot more fragile than it appears on the surface. And so all of this is to say is that the humanitarian pause it's a cruel joke, but I think it is indicative of a larger problem for the U.S. in particular, which is that it really has no options here. It doesn't really have much room to operate within. It can't give in. It can't try to rein in its attack dog, Israel, because that would make Israel, and in some respects there are large portions of the neocon foreign policy establishment that would see the United States as looking weak if it did that. If it forced a so-called ceasefire, it means giving in to Hamas. I mean, that's what all of them are saying. That's what Blinken is saying, Biden is saying. But they also know that if every Palestinian in Gaza is dead in 5 months, 6 months, or completely entirely displaced, and Israel's final solution is complete utter occupation, well, it also understands that that's a nightmare in and of itself. That's completely against international law. That's against everything that the United States has claimed to stand for since the end of the 1967 war. That is a public relations and diplomatic nightmare, one that if Joe Biden, forget about it, he can't recover from that. He's gone. But who knows how does the U.S. regime reconcile that reality? Does it embrace a new approach to Israel? Because guess what? The dominoes are going to begin to fall big time in the region if you think you're going to get away with that. Or do you reverse course and try to save face in some way? Well, what are you going to do? You've already let Israel do this. So it really is a quagmire. So everything that happens in the world at this point that involves the United States instigating, provoking, generating, leading, and directing conflict, it always ends up, it's usually starts now in a quagmire, but it always ends up in a quagmire. And that's what this is for the U.S.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that. And my final question that I have for you. So as of late, there's been over 10,000 people in Palestine that have been murdered by the state of Israel. We're approaching 10 times the amount of people that have been killed in Gaza than than Hamas has, as far as Israelis. So it's a major worldwide consensus that this is now a genocide. Looking at the millions of people speaking around the world, what do you think the next 12 to 18 months will look like for Palestine and the failing narrative of Israel?
Wow. That is a truly difficult thing to envision right now because of everything that you just stated. Because the onslaught is so intense, it's hard to look that far in the future and see much different. But we know that it's going to be a lot different because something like this cannot last. I mean, the idea that Israel, as I said before, could complete in this era some kind of final solution against the Palestinians, leading to possibly the extermination of Palestinians in Gaza, whether by way of murder or displacement. seems like an impossibility to conceive. But yet we are in a position where that is exactly what is happening. And so, we look at 12 to 18 months. That means the November elections have happened in the United States. And it also means that Israel has found it capable to wage this kind of war for this duration, which I'm no military expert, so I'm not so clear about that. I'm sure, though, it would mean that it would need additional support from the United States. So that means we would have had 12 to 18 months where the United States would have had to continue to support Israel in this way amid, as you're showing here, the massive protests against it. It would be hard to believe that the situation right now could continue onward because, unlike in past instances, this reminds me a little bit, although it's not the same, of course, because there isn't the element of, for example, U.S. citizens, civilians, residents being shipped off to war in a draft, so to speak. But this reminds me a little bit about the situation that occurred in Vietnam. So during the Vietnam War, one of the many ways that people gained empathy and solidarity with the anti-war movement, it wasn't that everyone just started joining in the streets and, with all the organizations organizing protests. It was that they saw the carnage that was happening in Vietnam. They witnessed it from their televisions. Now we are witnessing what's happening in Palestine, mainly from our computers and our phones on social media, but we're witnessing it nonetheless, and it's very close now. It's probably closer. This kind of war, this kind of onslaught is probably more visible to us than it ever has been. The same has happened in the Ukraine conflict. A lot of people who have followed the Ukraine conflict have been able to get direct footage of what is happening in order to be able to relate to such a conflict. So this, though, is different in the sense that, unlike the Ukraine conflict, where you can pass off blame on a Cold War foe and gin up Russophobia and all that. This kind of great power confrontation. Ooh, Russia's a boogeyman invading. You are having a situation where there's almost like a rewind of history in an attempt to do what the United States and, of course, Israel and its allies did during the War on Terror, which is paint a people in a region as a nation, really, if we talk about Palestine, as a bunch of terrorists, so they can just be eliminated. Well, people are kind of tired of that. That doesn't work as well as before. This is why you only see the most Karen-like, the most intensely Zionist-aligned folks talking about terrorism, this, terrorism, that. It's because most people, while they'll say, oh, we condemn what Hamas did, a lot of people might say that because, nobody likes to hear people are getting murdered. But even so, this narrative of, oh, they're all terrorists, let's get rid of them, and no, you can't support them. No, people see that ordinary people, civilians, women, children are being massacred. So to imagine that going on without these kind of protests that you're showing continuing and escalating even is hard to believe, because war fatigue is a very specific phenomenon. And when it comes to the kind of brutality that we're seeing, I just don't see it happening. The way that this is going, I'm pretty sure that people are going to continue to be angry about this, to rage against it, and it will have political consequences for the United States. So I guess in the next 12 to 18 months, I do see the United States attempting to pivot in some way, where they're trying to pivot with Israel and say, hey, like you gotta give a little here. This is not going to go well for you. Maybe they'll say, hey, Netanyahu, we're going to throw you under the bus. You won't have the kind of political power and influence that you've had over the years anymore if you continue to allow this to happen. And maybe then Netanyahu will say, oh, all right, I'll agree to that. Maybe we'll stop for a little while. Like something is going to give. Now, given the pushback against the ceasefire, it's hard to believe that in the next short period of time that it will be a ceasefire. But I could imagine a scenario where there is, after, of course, way too many Palestinians have been killed, way too many children, women, everyone have been killed. There is a scenario where the United States and perhaps Arab countries and perhaps the region, and maybe the United States is really on the periphery, but really that there's some kind of negotiation where there are, I mean, I think there already are discussions of the prisoners of war being released. And so over the next 12 to 18 months, could there be concessions made? Maybe we don't even hear that the concessions are made. Maybe actually nothing is given to Hamas. Maybe there's a deep fake and they say, okay, we'll release some. I think what Hamas wants is release of the thousands of Palestinians that are in prison. I think that's one of the biggest demands that they. We haven't heard much about it, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is, because why else do you take prisoners of war? It's not just to hold them and to give them pats on the back and to treat them nicely like they have been. It's to get something, right? It's to get something back. And there's about, I think, 5,000 to 10,000 Palestinians and some number in between that, Palestinians in Israeli prison, and all of them are considered political prisoners, not just to Hamas, but to most Palestinians. Because why are they in prison? Well, some of them were protesting. Some of them were just walking around and being Palestinians. Some of them were trying to work and whatnot. Some kids threw rocks at a tank, whatever.
Children.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. A lot of, there are hundreds of children. So they're all considered political prisoners. And so I think Hamas and a lot of the Palestinian resistance forces see that as a big demand. So we'll see whether the pressure can then lead to some kind of outcome. That's really what I can envision seeing, some kind of pressure release where there is this kind of like, well, if this keeps on going on, there'll be problems domestically for the United States, problems domestically for Israel, and also, there will be need to give a little because, it's hard to imagine just a full, just any kind of so-called pause or ceasefire without, at this point, Palestinians getting something, because I can't imagine with all the carnage and all the devastation that Hamas or any other Palestinian resistance group is going to say, okay, that's cool. But I can imagine it being like, no, actually, look at all that's been done. We're not going to give up these people. They haven't given up the prisoners of war yet. So it's hard to imagine that they'll all be released without some kind of give. But who knows? I can't be a predictor. Maybe I can't predict. I don't have a crystal ball. But the next 12 to 18 months, there will definitely be some changes coming. Unfortunately, if we're talking 12 to 18 months down the road and there still is an Israeli assault to any degree like the one right now, it means a lot of people are going to die. And it means that we are really, we've already witnessed a kind of crime of the century. Iran today, they released a statement. I think Iranian president released a statement saying this is the worst crime of humanity ever. Maybe that's a mistranslation because certainly it's hard to compare criminality when it comes to colonial regimes. But certainly it's being looked at, especially in the modern era, especially for the last 2-3 generations, given the scale, the density, the intensity, it's looked at as like a crime of the century, crime of a generation. Like this is a war crime of a generation, a crime against humanity of a generation. And
the millennium, the beginning of the millennium.
Can that go on at this intense rate forever? Well, no. Well, does it need to? No. Certainly, there are many different outcomes that could come about. I am holding on to optimism that the outcome of it will lead to positive developments for both Palestinians and the region for the coming future. However, it's also to say that it is still a possibility, and I'm going to hold it out there so people know that I'm not naive, that it could be that actually Israel and the United States achieve their objectives with this operation. And that's why it tones down. That's why it changes qualitatively, is because, well, Israel's killed enough. Israel's occupied enough. The United States is satisfied with that. That's it. Move on. And now the region, now Palestinians and the rest of the region have to deal with the consequences. That's certainly a possibility, but I'm holding out hope that given the international pressure, given the just criminality of this, that that some of these demands that are out there, both from the Arab world, the Muslim world, the people of the world, and the Palestinian people themselves, will be met to some degree.
Wow. Yeah, I agree. That's a very big question, and I'm glad you were able to take on the task of answering it. I appreciate it so much.